Seem like it's working? Well, good. This will be a great opportunity to test it out. Well, to kind of go back, the last couple of weeks we've been talking about Vipassana practice and how Vipassana is an ancient meditation technique and an ancient practice of insight, of looking deeply into our own experiences, and when we look objectively and patiently into our own experiences, we can start to see things that we don't normally notice. And we talked about how, to the degree that we resist pain, whether it's physical pain or emotional pain or difficult ideas, to the degree that we resist that stuff, that's the degree to which we suffer as a result of it. And we've had that experience of doing the meditation on physical pain, where we're able to allow space for physical pain to be and become very aware of it, and in that space we're able to let go of the suffering that comes along with it. And so we see that suffering is resistance in a very real sense. The suffering is caused by resistance. So this is one of the insights to this Vipassana practice. We start to, and insight really means that we have that as our own experience, as opposed to something we read or something we hear or something that we kind of work through intellectually and it makes a lot of sense. And we sort of, we agree with it, but once we start to have that experience, then it takes on a new significance, a new meaning, and a new importance. So we recognize that suffering is equal to pain met with resistance. And that's the outcome when we, and I'll read through the handout a little bit. First off, when we're not mindful or aware of our experiences at the surface level of consciousness. That Pali word sati, S-A-T-I, that means awareness of our experience, but with a surface level consciousness. So you could use the word attention, and it would kind of get to that same point. See, we're aware, really, all the time. There's a part of the mind that's always knowing, am I warm, am I cool, am I feeling an ache or a pain, am I tired, am I hungry? I mean, at this unconscious level of the mind, we're always aware of sort of the general feeling tone of the body and the mind and what's going on. But seldom are we aware of it at the surface level of consciousness, where we're really paying attention to it. And that's what makes all the difference. Darla was sharing with me that she's had some pain for quite a long time in rotator cuff. And just being aware of wanting to work with that, kind of being mindful at the level of attention, that she will go to it a few times a day, do some stretching, do some work with it, do a little self-induced physical therapy to loosen it up, and it's helping. But really the transformation is in the mindfulness, it's in the awareness of it. It's kind of like if you have any sort of a bad habit that you're trying to get rid of. It's being aware of that. I remember when I was a kid, I bit my nails constantly, just always chewed them down to nothing. And at one point, there was some product called Stop Bite or something like that. But it was like you could paint it on your fingers, and what it was designed to do is to stop you from biting your fingernails. So it would remind you. And I remembered putting it on, and then I would start biting my nails, and it tasted nasty and bitter. And I would think to myself, you know what? I can just chew right through this stuff. It doesn't stop me. It's not stopping me. But then there was kind of this recognition that, it requires some willingness on my part. It requires willingness to notice what's going on and to pay attention to it. So it can only do so much. It can only taste bitter and sort of remind me, you wanted to stop chewing on your fingernails, right? So it wasn't like it was going to physically stop me, but it was a reminder. So it's kind of like, that's what mindfulness is. That's what attention is on that surface level of consciousness. It is bringing it to that level where we can actually do something about it. But we have to be willing to participate in our own well-being. The second thing that we do when we're immersed in the suffering and the suffering of pain multiplied by resistance is that we are overly attached to things from the perspective of self. So we've probably all had that experience when we're somewhat selfless. We're kind of letting go of what we're uptight about, what our desired outcomes or our desired goals are, and we're just kind of in the moment, flowing with it, feeling free and good. That's a wonderful feeling. And then the more we're focused on, well, this is really what I want and how I want it, and for this long and in this way, and in that real focus on the self, we get more and more uptight. And so in the practice, when there's talk about letting go of this idea of the self, that's a really important one, because we find that, along with resistance to difficult experiences, the more obsessed I am with my own idea of self, the more stuff I'm putting in my own way, with which I can cause suffering. And then the third thing is, we fail to understand the impermanence of things. We experience a painful emotion, for example, and then we cling to it after it has dissipated, kind of reliving it in a sense. And that's in a way, that's kind of a sense of self. We sometimes say, well, I'm the guy who is depressed, or I'm the guy who's angry, and that's kind of where I go when I forget who I am. I kind of go back to my role. We had an interesting experience on Saturday. It was Saturday. We went to the Minnesota State Fair. And we got there early, got there at about 8:30 a.m. and walked around. We usually crisscross just about every street and see everything. We eat some different food and find stuff that doesn't have meat in it, and so we can eat stuff with lots of carbs in it. And so it was about 1:30, and we were kind of circling around the outer perimeter of the fairgrounds, and we had noticed a little while earlier that there were a couple of helicopters hovering overhead, which thought, well, don't really know. We started walking around toward the Space Needle thing in the front of the fair, and there was sort of a convergence of police heading towards the Space Needle area. And there was sort of this awareness of something seems kind of weird. Well, we didn't realize it at the time, but we had just sort of walked right on top of, at about 1:30, the Black Lives Matter protest had come from, they had met at Hamlin Park, and they had walked up Snelling, and then they had come to the fairgrounds. And it must have been right about at that moment, because that was kind of the moment that the police were there, and that was the moment that we just sort of, stumbled into this scene. And so we kind of came upon it, and it sort of dawned on us right away. There was, they had closed the gates of the fairgrounds. So there was all these metal fences that had been closed, and they have barbed wire over the top of them, and that's the way the fencing is around there. But they had closed the gates, and then there were two lines of police. There was a line of police inside, kind of keeping fairgoers back, and there was a line of police outside, keeping protesters on that side. And then there were protesters with drums and a loudspeaker, and they were, saying different things, much of which we really couldn't hear because they were kind of projecting it outward, and we were on the inside. And there were police on horses with helmets, and it was like, wow, yeah, it was a surreal, it was a surreal experience. Yeah, nobody in or out through that gate. And so there were people kind of coming up to it, sort of like us, where they realized they stumbled into something that, was kind of a big deal. And so it's like, wow, here we are, and I didn't expect to see this. And then there's people shouting, and there's people on the inside, and there's a little bit of like murmuring from some of the people on the inside. But for the most part, it was just kind of people looking. And there were some people filming who with like phones and things like that, who looked like, wow, I've never seen anything like this. Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was quite an experience. But then we saw there was a couple of people from the news station, from KARE 11 News, kind of came through the crowd.
Peaceful on the inside.
Yeah, it was pretty peaceful in the inside. A few people making like dumb comments and stuff. Yeah, and that's kind of what we were just hoping is, this is like, you can see how this is sort of like there's tension and, and there's helicopters and there's police and the whole thing just had this really tense energy to it. And yeah, it was like, boy, I just hope nobody does anything dumb, So KARE 11, there were a couple of people that came in from the news, because they have those news tents set up around the fair. So there was a reporter and a cameraman came through the crowd. They kind of worked their way through us, and they worked up to the police line just in front of us, which was, like 25 feet in front of where we were standing. And so the cameraman worked his way up. Now there was this man who I had noticed, probably just because he was bigger than anybody else, but he was on the fairgoer side. He's this tall guy. He was about my age. Yeah. Kind of a shaved head. He was wearing a black sleeveless T-shirt. He's a pretty big guy. I mean, I wouldn't want him angry at me. And he had a T-shirt on. It was like one of those American flag T-shirts, black T-shirt, and it was something like, if you want to burn a flag, burn.
You don't like our flag, I'll help you pack.
Yeah, it was something like that. So, and fine, whatever. Not judging really any part of that. But here's the interesting thing and kind of the point of the story, which was I had noticed him just because of his size and that he was pretty much directly in front of me, facing the crowd. But at one point, the reporter and the cameraman just happened to go up and stand right next to this guy. And when he saw the reporter and the cameraman, he sort of erupted into starting to shout at the protesters. And it was at that moment that the camera then panned over and looked right at this guy, and this big guy, and he's starting to shout, go home, get out of here, this kind of stuff. And it was
All lives matter.
Yeah, I'm not sure I recall exactly what he was saying. But anyway, he was shouting this. But the thing I thought was that in the moment the camera kind of turned on him, or he saw the reporter, he sort of remembered, this is my story. I'm the guy who's a racist, or I'm the guy who's loud and belligerent and tough, or I'm the guy that, isn't afraid to shout.
The flag wasn't the Confederate flag?
No, it wasn't. But it just struck me as, and again, not in like a judgmental way, but more in a way that, isn't it true how we sort of have this stuff that we identify with, this sense of self, and we kind of go to that by default when we're under stress, or when the adrenaline kicks in. We kind of go to that place. And that was sort of my observation with him, is that there he was, observing kind of quietly with the rest of the crowd, nothing going on. Camera came, sort of that must have been some recognition, and then he brought that out, And even though that was for the camera and it was kind of this unusual protest moment, I thought, hey, each of us in our own way, when we're under stress or when something's happening that we find difficult, we often revert back to that strong sense of self, what we identify with. This is who I am. This is kind of my history. This is what I hold on to. And while that's important stuff in many ways, it's, I'm not saying, forget who you are or where you come from or what your history is. There's a way to honor that, but not to be bound by it at the same time. And I think that, so often that sense of self, rather than being something that's a benefit to us, it's more something that binds us and kind of gets us back into the same way of thinking about things that has always sort of caused us suffering and misery before, So it was just one of those sort of seeing this happen and just sort of feeling like sort of a space alien in the middle of this whole thing, observing it. But in a way, that's sort of what objective awareness in our own self is that we can cultivate that ability to see that in ourselves, and that's really tough to do. Especially when we're angry or hurt, or we're feeling like we have been screwed over in life so many times, or like, we just can't take anymore, all very natural, real things. But we start to identify with this, we go back into these patterns. So that's kind of number 3 on here. It ties into that sense of self, which is number 2, but it ties into the failing to understand the impermanence of things. We experience a painful emotion or a difficult situation, and even after it has gone away or dissipated, we relive it. We kind of replay it over and over with this habit energy. It's called a sankhara in Pali, but it's this habit energy of taking myself back to it. And, at any given time, it might be I'm the depressed guy, or I'm the victim, or I'm the guy who's just kind of been taken for granted, or whatever it is. And the more we identify with that stuff, the more we identify with the negativity of it, and the more it kind of traps us.
Could it too be I'm the one that has to be strong? I have to, endure other people's pain in order to come across as the strong one, or actually maybe not be the strong one?
Yeah. I mean, I think it can be, and to use that man as an example at the fair, I mean, there was probably a part of him that very much identified was kind of being the tough guy, and being the one that is not to be messed with by anyone. And I remember back in the business world that I even had sort of a sense of that, more in a businessy sense, that, hey, I'm the shrewd, cutthroat business guy, and, don't mess with me kind of a thing. So there's sometimes this I need to be strong, and it can be to our own detriment. So it's not seeing things as they really are. It's sort of this artificial self we put on, almost like a mask, almost like that T-shirt that he put on, which certainly made a statement, or the way we carry ourselves. So Vipassana, again, it means insight, seeing into our own experiences in a way that helps liberate us from the suffering we experience now, and from unknowingly setting the stage for future suffering. So it's really being able to look at this. So mindfulness, so important, because we have to be able to look at what's going on here, and look at it at the surface level of consciousness, and then we have to do it objectively, which means we don't judge ourselves as, well, that's a dumb thought, or a stupid thought, or an evil thought, or a hateful thought. It's just, here's this thought. There's anger, there's ill will, whatever it is. There's sort of an objective recognition that this is what's going on inside of me. And before we start to react to that, to replay those troublesome habit energies, we become aware of it, and we realize in that moment that we can change it in a positive way.
You have suffering, and you really liberate yourself, and then the same suffering occurs over and over. And you just keep immune.
It's a continuous practice, knowing that, as human beings who are social beings, and we have family and friends and loved ones and work and experiences and all these things, that we're just exposed to this stuff, this raw material of which life is made. We're exposed to that over and over. And so if you care about somebody very deeply, and you're really worried about them, worried about their health, or you're fearful or something for that person, there's a part of you that, out of love and out of compassion, is sort of re-experiencing this fear over and over. Now, and I want to be careful about how we talk about this, because I'm not saying in any way that those feelings aren't real or valid or important. But what we can start to recognize is around those strong emotions, that there are a lot of reactions going on within us that either serve to make things worse or to make things better. So there can be a place in us where we honor this. Yeah, I'm worried about this person. I'm worried about this person's health, or I'm worried about this situation. This is coming up. This is a real thing. It's not make-believe. However, within that, because I am aware at the surface level of consciousness, I can actually look at that as it comes up, and I can see it for what it is. And in seeing it for what it is, I can avoid the habit pattern of reacting to it over and over with a lot of, sometimes we call them thought tornadoes, where it's like, what if this bad thing happens? What if that bad thing happens? I don't know if I can take this anymore. You're sort of feeding this a little bit with these things, and when you observe them carefully, you start to see how that there is a difference between my genuine concern and caring for this person, my love and compassion. There's a difference between that feeling and between kind of all this negative self-talk that sort of gets me scared and makes me worry over and over. So that's kind of what I mean when I talk about honoring that painful emotion, but at the same time recognizing the stuff that you're adding to it and starting to let go of that. So in the practice of Vipassana, one of the things that we do, and this was what we did in the pain meditation, the working with pain, was to become aware of physical pain in our body, and then to become aware of our reactions to that pain, and look at them long enough and objectively enough to start to recognize that, yeah, there's a very subtle difference between the two. There's pain, there's my reaction to the pain. And the more you look at it, the more you can see, yeah, I'll be darned if that's not true. That's really what's going on here. The same thing can be true in our emotions. We can be feeling a real difficult emotion, and if we're not paying attention to it, if we're not mindful of it, that emotion is kind of there in the background, and we're ruminating in the background. We're kind of throwing extra fuel in there. Yes, this bad thing could happen. I can imagine that bad thing happen. I can imagine, getting a call from a hospital with bad news, or I can imagine, all of these kinds of things. I can imagine those. That stuff is all just sort of playing over and over in the background at the unconscious level, and we're sort of aware of it, but mostly we're just aware of, I really feel awful. I feel scared. I feel afraid. This is great suffering. So the counterintuitive thing is to actually look at it, because that's like, as I've shared the example, if this bowl was a pot of hot water boiling on the stove and I tried to pick it up, I'd feel pain, and my natural reaction would be pull away from the pain. Emotions are different in that they're in us and we can't physically pull away. So we pull away emotionally, and we pull away mentally. And so we kind of shove it down, we ignore it, we busy ourselves with other things, we do things to distract ourselves, lots of different things. Or sometimes we overpower it with kind of artificially positive thoughts. But the technique is to really look at, this is the emotional pain. What is the feeling of emotional pain just by itself? And let yourself experience that at the attention level, the surface level of the mind. So an example would be, if there's something that you're afraid of, something you're worried about. If you're doing your Vipassana practice, you're sitting in meditation, and this thought comes up, or this difficult, painful emotion comes up, you're aware of this feeling. Naturally, when we become aware of our emotions, a lot of times the first thing we do is we want to latch onto it and say, this is me. I am having this experience. But as soon as we personalize it, it makes it difficult to look at it objectively. So one of the techniques is to give it a name, note it in a very general way, like fear. So not my fear, not I am feeling fearful or afraid, but just fear. So you're kind of aware. Fear has arisen. Now at that point, you can try and return to your breath, allow the fear to go away. Maybe it does. But if it doesn't, if it's coming back, well, then this is a thing you need to deal with. So that's usually a good time to say, yeah, I need to actually focus on this pain as pain. I need to focus on this fear as fear. So the stuff that you can't just let go of, turn your consciousness directly on it and become aware of it. There is fear, or there is anger. So you're mentally noting this. You don't have to say it out loud. But in this way, you're kind of naming it, sort of freezing it out there in an objective way, not personalizing it. And then the next thing is to start to become aware of the physical sensations around that thing, whatever you're calling it. So you're not letting it spiral into the next thing, like, so what are my thoughts about this fear, and what's the worst that could happen, and what, all of that. But you're starting to focus on what are the physical characteristics within me around this fear. So you're observing that. There's an objectivity and there's an equanimity to it as well. And equanimity being that you're not resisting, you're not holding on to anything, you're not pushing anything away. You're letting it flow through you to the extent that you can. But you find doing this in meditation that you're much more capable of doing it than you would be at any other time. It's sort of like after we do our practice in the beginning, each week, there's that point at which you sort of feel like you are just really solid and stable in your experience of the present moment. And that, just about anything could happen and you'd be able to just sort of work with that. You feel extraordinarily capable, and it's sort of beyond your normal sense of how you'd be able to deal with things, that sort of feeling. So that's why doing this in meditation is really helpful. Because, if you're in the midst of really worrying or being fearful or panicking or feeling sick, it's hard to do that with wisdom.
So really when you're practicing it in the Vipassana, you're kind of, in a sense, the way I'm seeing it, is almost giving yourself a new program to work with it in real life situations. That would be a reasonable way to describe it. So just to kind of review a couple of steps, normally all this difficult stuff is happening at kind of the unconscious level of the mind, because it's not something that we want to embrace and really look at and bring it right up front, close and personal, and pay attention to it. So we don't really want to deal with it, because that's our natural inclination. Pain is something we don't want to get closer to. We'd rather get further away from it. That's true of emotional pain. It's true of physical pain. So that's the first step, is to be aware at the surface level of consciousness so that you actually get a clear look at what it is. So it's not all of these other things. It's not all my worst case scenarios or fears or memories, but here's this fear. Fear. Looking at it. What are the physical sensations of it? And you'll find right away in just this sort of making it a little more objective, letting go of the strong personal identification with it, looking at it at the surface level of the mind. A good example of this, if you've ever had a nightmare, bad dream, and it's like in the dream you're terrified, but you get this moment in the dream where you know you're dreaming and you want to consciously wake up because you know you're dreaming in the dream. Have you ever had that?
experience. And so there's a part of you that wants to wake up. You want to come out of it because you want to see things clearly as they really are. And then at some point you wake up from the dream and there's that moment of clear consciousness. You're looking, this is what's happening. There's no monster, there's no bad guy, there's no, these things in the dream aren't real. Here I am, I'm looking right at it. And there's this moment where you really embrace reality with a clear mind, and it just sets you free. This is very much that same type of experience. And it's also on that same kind of deep consciousness level that dream experience is. So it's like, yeah, I'm having this nightmare. It's just terrible. I'm fearing all kinds of things. I'm worrying about all sorts of things over and over and over again. So there's this moment of waking up, really looking clearly at it. It's still an unpleasant, difficult emotion. It's still fear, or it's still pain.
And it seems so real.
And it is real, but a lot of this other stuff that you're adding to it is stuff that you're adding to it. So focusing on what is really there is the first step in setting yourself free, if that makes sense. There's kind of the next section here, and I think this might be a really good place to leave off for tonight, just because it kind of does go into the next section. So we'll pick this up at page 2 there with the heading Experience. We'll pick it up there next week, and we'll go from there. But you can read ahead, and this stuff is all explained in a way that will definitely be helpful. But let's just take a couple of minutes to sort of let go of the things we're thinking about and sort of the intensity of the discussion and the teachings, and just give ourselves a minute to cultivate some compassion, cultivate some kindness, and some love, and some peace. Take a moment to really feel a strong, noble desire for all beings to be free from suffering, and for all beings to be free from the causes of suffering. And all beings, that's us, that's you, that's me, that's everyone else. And we're trying to feel that and express that genuinely, regardless of how people got to the place they are, why they're suffering, what bad choices they made, what dumb things they did. We're just trying to open up and saying, regardless, and me included, all the dumb things I've done, all the wrong things I've done, may all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. And that so naturally just leads into, may all beings be surrounded by real love and kindness. Real love and kindness. Because after all, so much of the suffering that all beings experience is due to a lack of love and kindness. So may all beings experience love and kindness. And may all beings experience joy, real happiness. Not a materialistic joy or a temporary joy, but a real, genuine joy. Uncaused joy. And may all beings be peaceful, free, and equanimous. And just make a space in your heart where this can be possible. And most especially, may you, in this room here tonight, may you be truly, truly happy. Namaskar. Thank you so much
Yeah.
for coming.